Hello, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. It's March the 3rd, 2026. It's getting to be a little bit like spring here on Mystery Island. I hope that it's starting to turn a little bit warmer for you guys, wherever you are. Thanks for joining me this morning on a very important topic. In 1962, President John F. Kennedy decided to take the special operations capacity away from the CIA and give it to the Pentagon. For that purpose, the Pentagon created the office of SACSA, where my father was drafted as one of the initial members of that organization, led by Marine General Victor Krulak. We've studied this in detail here at McDuff Lives. You can find 6 previous shows on SACSA that I did last year. So the details are all available now. What has interested me today is, when did it officially end? When did Congress or the executive take special ops away from SACSA and give them back to, obviously, the CIA? And the answer is in Executive Order 12333, which was the order which supported the enterprise created by George H.W. Bush, selling arms for drugs in Central America, the Iran-Contra affair. So I'm going to be digging into that with the help of an article from 1996 from Executive Intelligence Review. So let's get started, and I should say, let's go. Hello again, I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. You know, McDuff is the name that I gave to my father when I started doing my research publicly, so as to kind of stay under the radar screen, keep his name out of the search engines for as long as I could. But it's Thomas F. O'Loughlin Jr., if you want to search him. His dates are March 21st, 1920 to June the 6th, 1971, when he died of quick cancer while working at SACSA. One of the themes of my show has been that if we can understand what happened to my dad, why he died so young at early 51, and what happened to SACSA, why did it suddenly just dissolve and disappear, we can understand the mechanism for which the coup plotters that killed JFK have been operating the government, and especially operating special activities, quote unquote, which is code word for covert operations. Let me review just briefly what SACSA is. It is an acronym for the name of an officer, and that person is called the SACSA. And the acronym stands for Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities. Now, as you know, President Kennedy's decision to take special operations back away from the CIA and fire Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell, and Charles Cable, all of those events are very well known. The fact that President Kennedy did that was a huge problem for all of the ongoing ops and deals that had been set in motion since the early 50s in the Eisenhower administration by the Dulles brothers and the special ops that they were running using their special agent, Edward Lansdale, whose idea of special ops included a lot of nasty things, torture, for instance, assassination, and terror tactics, which is not the way that JFK would have run it. So one of the problems that I look at or one of the observations that I make is that General Victor Krulak, the Marine general who Kennedy appointed as the SACSA, understood counterinsurgency very well, had written on it, and continued to write on it. And his ideas were that you provide a safe place for the citizenry of the country you're trying to defend. You support their needs, where it be a hospital or a school, but mainly your job is to give them a sense of safety and comfort, and therefore relying on the national government as opposed to the invaders, the Viet Cong in this case. That was standard American counterinsurgency doctrine. However, a major change happened when, in the beginning of World War II, President Roosevelt turned to the British for assistance in setting up our own information or special services called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And it was during that basic joining at the hip of the British system of counterinsurgency, which included the Ed Lansdale type of special ops, into the OSS version under General, sorry. Why can't I call his name? Donovan, General Wild Bill Donovan. Whoa, sorry about that. Wild Bill Donovan, quite a character, and somebody who we learned in the book, the Scorsese Papers, which I read from about a month ago, and I encourage you to check out that show. In the Scorsese Papers by Major Ralph Gannis, we learned that it was, in fact, Wild Bill Donovan who was a principal in the corporation that became Permindex, and that he was running a kind of a private covert action service. That kind of privatized covert action service is the subject of the piece I'm going to read from Executive Intelligence Review, because this is what happened when President Reagan signed off on Executive Order number 12,333. So I'm going to let the author of this article tell the story for a while, and then I'll get back and make some comments. But think about, as I'm reading this, how Iran-Contra had the same issues. The number one, will Congress be able to decide when we go to war or not? Or have we lost has Congress ceded or lost the power to declare war? And it seems that they have. And so it's important to us to study, how did that happen? That's part of what we're going to be looking at in this article. The second part of it is privatizing the nasty stuff. That's Jeffrey Epstein. You see, so what President George H.W. Bush was doing was setting up a system of privatized covert action that leads to the incredible extension of national security as a reason for anything, whether it's child trafficking or narcotics, or assassination. And these things are done by cutouts, by private action, or nowadays it looks like, with what we've been able to learn from the Snowden and the uh, and Julian Assange, etc., that these kind of things are now officially okay and done. That is the dark side of counterinsurgency. Well, I want to start with Wikipedia just to get everybody grounded as to where we're at here. Um, this is Wikipedia of the Iran-Contra affair. The Iran-Contra affair, also referred to as blah, 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 was a political scandal in the United States that centered on arms trafficking to Iran, facilitated by senior officials of the Reagan administration. Under the Boland Amendments, a series of laws passed by Congress and signed by Ronald Reagan, further funding of the Contras was prohibited by Congress. But Reagan administration continued funding them secretly using non-appropriated funds. See, this is the Iran-Contra story, that it's just the tip of the iceberg. When we get into the article written by Executive Intelligence Review, you're going to see a lot of depth behind what I just read. All right, the affair was investigated, blah, blah, blah. Arms embargo. Those of you that were alive at the time probably remember this, but here's the meat of the nut right here. The Reagan administration's policy toward Nicaragua produced a major clash between the executive and legislative branches as Congress sought to limit, if not curb altogether, the ability of the White House to support the Contras. Direct U.S. funding of the insurgency was made illegal through the Boland Amendment. By 1984, funding for the Contras had run out, and in October of that year, a total ban came into effect. During the fiscal year 1985, no funds available to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, or any other agency or entity of the United States involved in intelligence activities may be obligated or expended for the purpose of, or which may have the effect of, supporting directly or indirectly military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua by any nation, organization, group, movement, or individual, quote unquote. That's the Boland Amendment. So you see, Congress has made a very, very determined effort to stop this thing going on. This is the same fight that's being brought by Thomas Massey and Ro Khanna in Congress today, that no, you can't do this. The Congress has the authority to wage war. Just look at the Constitution. In violation of the Boland Amendment, senior officials of the Reagan administration continued to secretly arm and train the Contras and provide arms to Iran, an operation they called TheEnterprise. And that's part of the title of the show today, is From SACSA to the Enterprise. Given the Contras' heavy dependence on U.S. military and financial support, the Second Boland Amendment threatened to break the Contra movement and led to President Reagan ordering that the NSC keep the Contras together, quote, body and soul, no matter what Congress voted for. Wow. A major legal debate occurred. The broader constitutional question was the power of Congress versus the power of the presidency. As part of the effort to circumvent the Boland Amendment, the NSC established the Enterprise, an arms smuggling network headed by a retired U.S. Air Force officer turned arms dealer, Richard Secord. Richard Secord is one of the actors in my father's story in as regard to the Vietnam era that supplied arms to the Contras. Okay, a U.S. Air Force officer who was very CIA connected, by the way, goes private and supplies arms to the Contras. It was ostensibly a private sector operation, but was in fact controlled by the National Security Council, i.e., it was controlled by George Bush Sr. To fund the enterprise, Reagan administration was constantly on the lookout for funds that came from outside the U.S. government, thus not technically violating the exact phrasing of the amendment regardless of the money's ultimate purpose. All right. So you see, that was the creation of the enterprise, and I wanted to start with something that everybody would probably identify as, yeah, that's the story, and that's the story that you get in Wikipedia. But now I want to tell the other side of the story. Thanks for joining me. I'm glad to see you here. Well, there's a quick question. The book I read several years ago about the Jesuits, etc. Yeah, I think you're thinking of Rulers of Evil by Tupper Saucy. And you can still see that in my archives on most of my channels. It's still there. There's probably 14 or 15 hours of my readings with comments. Okay, let me get this. I'm using StreamYard for my production here. It's fairly expensive, but I think it's very much worth it with all the abilities I have to broadcast on 8 channels right now, and very easy to work on. So, and I appreciate the support that helps me to pay for this and all the other services that go into making McDuff Lives. All right, September 13th, 1996. How the Iran-Contra investigation protected Bush's secret drug network. Executive Intelligence Review. What do you think of as the biggest scandal of the 1980s? If you answered Iran-Contra, then you answered the way the American public has been programmed to think. On 25th of November, 1986, a myth was born. It was a hoax promoted by the news media, which had the effect of protecting a, quote, secret government apparatus, much of whose operations were financed by proceeds of drug smuggling, which operated under the total and complete control of Vice President George Bush. On that date, at a press conference, Attorney General Edwin Meese, for the first time, linked the recently exposed illegal Contra support operations to the Iran arms for hostages scandal. Meese linked these two hitherto separate operations, previously labeled Contragate or Iran-Gate or Iran scam, by revealing that monies from arms transactions between Israel and Iran had been diverted, quote unquote, to the Contras. The only person in the United States government that knew precisely about this, declared Meese, was Oliver North, a member of the staff of the National Security Council, operating out of the White House. From that point on, the ever-compliant news media focused all their attention on Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and on something that came to be called Iran-Contra. Then, most of the media devoted their efforts to trying to find out how much President Ronald Reagan knew about what North was doing. Ultimately, televised congressional hearings were held, which gave us the famous images of Oliver North. North was absolutely not a renegade or a loose cannon on the National Security Council staff. He was simply a staff member of a well-defined but secret operating structure headed by George Bush. This apparatus ran a myriad of covert operations, spied on U.S. citizens, ran guns all over the world, and was responsible for bringing a virtual flood of drugs into the United States. That's what the Iran-Contra hoax was intended to hide. Bush's, quote, national security cartel, unquote. Bush's secret government apparatus, built up from 1981 to 1986, drew upon the CIA and the Department of Defense's special operations capabilities. Special ops, okay? But the operations run by Bush's White House apparatus were neither CIA nor Pentagon operations. Rather, they were set up in order to bypass the official agency structure of the federal government. In many cases, the apparatus was used to do things that the CIA could not or would not do. It cohered with the, quote, privatization, unquote, of many CIA and U.S. intelligence operations, a process which spun off the free-floating intelligence operatives, often called the asteroids. Interesting. You know, I think of Jeffrey Epstein when he says to his investors, we've got to stop trying to be nonprofit, because if we're going to make money, we've got to stop, pretending that we're not, and we've got to become a private entity. And so they privatized all of this vaccine business. Privatizing things that, in order to avoid congressional scrutiny, is the name of the game, right? And that's what they've been doing. So this is an early but seminal example of exactly that. To understand how Bush's secret government worked, we must look at the, quote, crisis management, unquote, apparatus in the White House. Crisis management, apparatus in the White House and the misnamed National Security Council staff, which is not a staff for the National Security Council, but a staff for White House operations involving national security. Subtle difference. In December 1981, President Reagan signed Executive Order 12333, designed to, quote, unleash U.S. intelligence agencies from the restrictions of the 1970s. EO 12333, governing all foreign intelligence operations, including provisions for the use of private assets by the intelligence and law enforcement community. EO 12333 also designated the National Security Council as, quote, the highest executive branch entity, unquote, for review, guidance, and direction of all foreign intelligence, counterintelligence, and, quote, special activities, unquote. And in parentheses, i.e., covert operations. This effectively put the NSC in charge of the CIA, military intelligence, special ops, etc. This did not mean the president's national security advisor, but the NSC staff structure, which for these areas was run by George Bush. How did that work? This is interesting. It's a little trip through bureaucraties that enabled Bush to get away with it. I'm going to follow through this little trail. On January 12, 1982, National Security Decision Directive Number 2, NSDD-2, was issued, which formalized the National Security Council structure. It created a series of senior interagency groups, SIGs, for foreign policy, defense policy, and intelligence. There is no reference to the vice president in NSDD2. But a month earlier, on December 14th, 1981, in between the adoption of EO 12333 and NSD2, National Security Decision Directive number 3 had already been issued, entitled Crisis Management, quote unquote. It set the stage for George Bush's takeover of intelligence and secret operations. NSDD3 created the Special Situation Group, SSG, quote, chaired by the vice president, unquote. There you go. Which provided that a national security matter which needed to be handled more rapidly than routine NSC staff functions could provide, quote, may be considered in the context of crisis management, unquote. Crisis management was designated as the responsibility of Bush's SSG. Then, on May 14, 1982, an implementing memorandum created the Crisis Pre-Planning Group, subordinate to the SSG. The SSG CPPG, headed by the Vice President, was placed on the same level as the National Security Council. Whoa! You just created this little hidden super agency and put it at the same level as the National Security Council? Yep. That's what they did. On the same level as the National Security Council and superior to the Secretary of State. It was this to which Secretary of State George Shultz vigorously objected. The CPPG was an interagency body which included representatives of the CIA, Pentagon, White House, State Department, and other agencies. Its staff coordinator was, drumroll, Oliver North. Thus, under NSDD3, one man was in charge of, quote, the secret government machinery. This structure combined as much as possible all intelligence and foreign policy, quote, crisis management, unquote, under the operational control of the Vice President of the United States. The Bush apparatus continued to grow during the next couple of years. On April 10, 1982, President Reagan signed NSDD 30, creating the, quote, Terrorist Incident Working Group, unquote, or TWIG, to support, quote, the Special Situation Group, i.e. Bush. Then, in July 1985, President Reagan named Bush to head up a new terrorism task force, consisting of representatives of the Department of Defense, CIA, State, and the NSC, plus the FBI's Oliver Buck Revell and the Israeli Amiram Nir. Wait a minute. We just included an Israeli in our terrorism task force? Okay. The task force's report, issued in February 1986, created a permanent extension of the task force, the Operations Subgroup, officially a subgroup of Bush's TWIG. It also established a permanent counterterrorism office located in the NSC staff, headed by, guess who? No drum roll this time, Oliver North. North's two assistants, Craig Coe and Robert Earl, were simply reassigned from Bush's task force. The operations subgroup was an interagency coordinating group which operated so as to bypass the regular intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Isn't that exactly what Alan Dulles set up with his focal point system back in the 1950s and or 60s? Yes, it is a way to bypass the chain of authority and get to the right person and get it done. And, you know, this is how secrets are kept from Congress. For example, when the FBI's Revell was operating under the authority of the OSG, he would report to the OSG, not the FBI director. The OSG was used, among other things, to run domestic surveillance and dirty tricks against Bush's enemies, particularly against opponents of the Contra policy. One well-documented incident of Operation Subgroup targeting of the secret government's enemies list is the case of Jack Terrell, a soldier of fortune type who was a source for congressional investigations and news media exposure of the Contra drug running operation, beginning in March 1986. Terrell had been interviewed by federal investigators in Miami who were looking into both gun running and drug trafficking in connection with the Contras, and was thus a federal witness. In response to two news programs on Contra involvement in drug running, one on National Public Radio and the second on CBS, North and Major General Richard Secord, retired, parentheses, set in motion their plan to silence Terrell, which is documented in materials released by the Congressional Iran-Contra Committee. As part of this, FBI official Buck Revell deployed these FBI's Special Operations Groups to conduct intensive surveillance of Terrell. Other FBI officials objected, charging that North, quote, was trying to interfere with a Bureau investigation into allegations that the Contras were involved in running drugs, unquote. Boy, does that sound like the TDY mission, in which my dad was trying to establish that the CIA was running drugs. And the idea that, there's a lot of good, honest FBI people out there that are trying to bust these criminals without knowing that these criminals are actually working for the secret government run out of the White House by then Vice President George H.W. Bush. Excuse me. Iran-Contra. It was to divert attention from this growing focus on Contra drug running that the official Iran-Contra investigation and cover-up was set in motion. The Iran portion of Iran-Contra generally refers to certain initiatives taken by the Reagan-Bush administration to sell a number of missiles to Iran in hopes of obtaining the release of American hostages being held in Lebanon. There was nothing criminal in this initiative, although it violated stated U.S. policy and possibly violated certain civil statutes. In comparison with large-scale arms and munitions sales to Iran following the release of the U.S. hostages in January 1981, which were either carried out directly by the Reagan-Bush administration or approved by it, the 1985-86 initiatives were relatively insignificant. I just want to stop and go back and say, this is 1981, October surprise. Reagan wins the election, and immediately the hostages are released. Well, what we learn here is that also Iran got a whole lot of missiles and arms in exchange for that, courtesy of the Reagan administration. The Contra half of Iran-Contra refers to covert U.S. support for the Nicaraguan Contras carried out during 1984 to 86 over the objections of Congress and in violation of the Boland Amendments to congressional budgetary authorizations. Support for the Contras was drawn from private and off-budget funds administered through a semi-private operational network known as, quote, TheEnterprise, unquote. The focus on the diversion of funds from the Iran hostage operation to the Contras allowed a much bigger diversion, the diversion of public attention from much bigger scandals, especially the large-scale promotion of international drug trafficking by these Bush-run covert operations. The two biggest of these were the Contra operation in Central America and the Afghanistan War. In reality, the covert support for the Afghan, quote, freedom fighters was a much larger operation than the Contra operation and involved far more drugs than that in the Contra operation. It is estimated that the U.S. CIA spent $3 billion smuggling weapons to the Afghan Mujahideen. As with many such operations, the United States paid for it and the British controlled it through, quote, humanitarian, unquote, support groups, non-governmental organizations, etc. Even the $3 billion from the U.S. was a small portion of the total funding. Some sources say the Colombian, Medellin, and Cali drug cartels contributed $10 to $20 billion to the Afghan Mujahideen. Before the war started, very little opium and heroin came out of the Pakistan-Afghanistan area. By the mid-1980s, the Golden Crescent in Southwest Asia had surpassed the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia, providing one half of the heroin reaching the United States. As well, drug addiction within the area skyrocketed. In 1980, there were 5,000 addicts in Pakistan. By the mid-1980s, there were over 1.3 million. The Afghan operation, in parentheses, which gave us drugs in the 1980s, also produced the terrorist foot soldiers of the 1990s, who, after being cut loose at the end of the war in 1979, were picked up by British and derivative operations. In reference to EIR Special Report 1995, New Terror International Targets, Southeast Asia. These two covert operations, Afghanistan and the Contras, both of which resulted in flooding the United States with illegal narcotics, might have constituted something called Afghan-Contra or perhaps Narcogate, but instead, we got Iran-Contra and the story of Bush's drug trafficking scandals, which were already well known at the time, were suppressed. And that's all I will read from this article. It's certainly worth reading on to the next 2 or 3 pages. The details of the Iran-Contra deal are broken down in this article with a depth that you won't see in mainstream media. I really appreciate the opportunity to read it. 7 pages long total. Okay. So this is why I call this series Undo the Coup, because in November 22nd, 1963, a coup d'etat toppled the constitutional government of the United States of America by assassinating the president and by covering up the facts of the assassination, a cover-up which has continued to this day. The people that are covering it up are the people who took over the government on that day and their successors in interest. These people, undoubtedly allied to the Dulles brothers and their clients, and of course the expansion of all that through the Bushes and the Clintons and everyone else, has simply been the growth of the coup government, the secret government, the one that they hide from Congress, and the one that by now seems to have individual control over every person in our Congress. Very few exceptions. How does it happen? It happened by assassinating the president and by the people of the United States being brainwashed through the media, through people like Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, and subsequent talking heads in the thousands who should have known better, who did know better, and yet pushed this narrative of a crazy lone shooter. The same story that we get over and over again. And it's time. It's time to unpack this stuff, because this is how it happened. the subversion of President Kennedy's decision to take special ops away from the CIA and park them at SACSA in the Pentagon was his way to stop all this craziness in the world, such as these secret arms deals and the secret, uh, drug running, all of this stuff. It happens because we let them get away with it. And so I just want to join the chorus of people that are pounding on the desk and saying, let us have all of the information. Let us get a good, solid handle on exactly what happened to President Kennedy. And let us hold people and institutions responsible. Because just like in the Holocaust, if we don't make it stop, then it will happen again. Thank you for being with me today. I take this very seriously, and I urge everyone else to do so as well. If you haven't got a copy of my book yet, it's $10 on Amazon. It's called McDuff Lives. It'll give you the basic story, and I hope you do enjoy it. Thanks again. Talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.